together kititse with kitavo. In other words, it was really clear that you could not kitavo before you kitetsed, until you got the human relationships right and proper. And it doesn't mean everybody's your best friend, but it does mean that you treat all the people that are within your hand or within your sphere of influence, you treat them all with a predisposition of grace, even when judgment has to be executed. Even a corpse has to be treated with grace. So when we get those things right, and those are definitely things that we can get right no matter where we live. Without a priesthood, we can always work on our relationships. And if that's the precondition to kitavo, being able to come into the land, because if we didn't do that, obviously we're not going to be able to put that basket down at the feet of the priest and to recite that prayer, that declaration that you've not touched any of it in mourning, that there's death themes all through that. In other words, I haven't cleared it out while I was mourning. I've not dedicated any of it to the dead. And you're thinking, what's the obsession with the dead people here as it pertains to my tithe? And I taught a little bit last Shabbat. We were down in Nashville. We went camping there at Cedars of Lebanon to get away for a few days. And I ended up doing some teaching. But something I brought out to that congregation there was that in the previous Torah portion, it also talked about when you take a captive woman, then these are the requirements. If you want to marry her, you're going to have to give her a month to mourn for her parents. She's going to shave her head, she's going to trim her nails, and so forth. But the key there was you have to give her time to mourn, because a pure servant can be forced to work or to serve because it's not free will. It's enforced. However, if someone's going to enter into an agreement, or let's step it up a level because we're talking about marriage, if someone's going to enter into a covenant, a marriage covenant, in kitetse, but then in kitavo, now we're talking about, okay, we're starting to execute the covenant because there were certain things they learned about in the wilderness that they did not do, but then they began to do them. Remember, they didn't circumcise in the wilderness, but then they do circumcise before they can cross over the Yarden. Certain things had to be activated. So there will come a time, sometime, where all these rehearsals we do with the feasts, with Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, and everything in between, even though we're just rehearsing them right now while we're in our wilderness being tested, and he says, I'm testing you to see what's in your heart, to see if you humble yourself. Eventually, the design was to move us into the land. And that's when we saw that the holiness level got amped up. And all of a sudden, I have to be able to say that not only did I bring in my tithe according to the commandment, but that I did it in a happy state, basically. I wasn't in a state of mourning. And the question is, well, how can I make myself be happy if I'm not happy to begin with? And I thought that would be a really easy concept to give you. I made a little note here while I was studying this afternoon. And what I wrote was, I can be joyful or I can feel joyful. What's the difference? If I'm going to bring my Sukkot tithe in, I need to be joyful. It matters not if I feel joyful. Because remember, feelings are an expression of the nefesh, the soul. That includes your appetite, your emotion, your desire, and your intellect. Well, if emotion is part of my nefesh, and that was something that we keyed on last week, was the heart and the soul. As you brought that tithe in, it had to be a heart and a soul issue. And so it did not really matter if you could generate a feeling of joyfulness when you brought the tithe in. It was a state of being. And by declaring that, you're reminding yourself that executing the commandments is not to be something that causes us grief and mourning, because we freely entered into that agreement. The same thing with the captive woman. She has to be free to mourn her parents. If she's still in an emotional state of grieving and mourning, she is not entering into that marriage covenant freely. She's still a servant. She's still a captive. But the moment she can enter into that marriage agreement, she becomes a free woman, because she's not being coerced. She's not being forced. She's been awarded her time of mourning and grieving. And so you're not going to touch the holy things, like we said last week, when you're in a state of being grieved. All right. Now, I thought that would be really easy to teach. And right before this class started, about 8:47, I just found out my cousin died. I haven't had a chance to call yet to see what's going on. So in a weird way, sometimes the Torah portions, they challenge us. They challenge us according to what's really going to happen in our lives. And so the challenge here is, do I feel joyful right now? Probably not. But can I be joyful right now? I most certainly can. Because what we have in front of us is something holy. And we don't want to touch the holy things if we are in a state of captivity to our emotions. And so that's kind of the picture of the captive woman. We carry it from kitetse over to kitavo. So now you're going to enter into this marriage covenant of the Torah. You're going to enter into it freely. And because you are entering into it freely, you're going to have to assure the priest before heaven that you have cleaned out this tithe that you're bringing in, not just in a happy state, but in a free state. Because when you're in grief, you're never closer to the Father than when you're grieving. You realize that? It says he is close to the brokenhearted. He's right there. You're never going to be closer to him than you are in a broken relationship, a broken heart. But can you serve him? There's a little bit of a difference there. We don't tend to make that distinction because for us, we don't really have to think about walking up to a temple and making a sacrifice or taking a tithe. That's kind of remote. That's not even in our context, really. We read about it, but we've never done it like, say, people in the first century did. And so as we're working through that problem, that's what we realize is, okay, I have to practice clearing out this tithe in a joyful state. And that means I am a free person. I can freely do this. I am free to agree to this act of worship. I'm not being forced. I'm not like a captive woman. I'm not really acting upon the threat that says, if you don't do this, remember the blessings and the cursings? You see, we already knew they were coming because we'd already heard about these two mountains they were going to stand on. But until you got to last week's Torah portion and you're thinking, good grief, these curses go on and on. How many more pages of curses could there possibly be? So in a very real way, it shows us that if it's not a heart and soul, if it's not a free service, if it's not a free agreement in our hearts to keep this Torah, if we are in I call it, I like the wording in the book of Acts. It says the gall of bitterness. Remember, he's trying to purchase the power of the Holy Spirit. And the apostles tell him, you're in the gall of bitterness. You're doing religious things, but you're doing them out of bitterness. And so we can do Torah things, but a lot of times we have dragged in our bitterness of heart into this holy word. And instead of keeping the commandments freely, instead of being joyful with them and saying, hey, these commandments were given to me to serve others with a whole heart. And by serving others, that's how I serve him. That's how he wants me to conduct myself. He says, if you have something against your brother, put my gift down at the altar, go make it right with your brother, and then come give me mine. That's the nature of Yeshua. He comes as a servant first, and as the king second. So the king of the universe is saying, you get that human relationship right, and then you come back and talk to me. Because then I know you're giving me that gift out of free will. You're truly serving me with a free heart. Otherwise, this sadness of heart that you have, I don't know what words you exchanged with your brother in the field on the way here. Remember the story of Cain and Abel? I don't know what words you exchanged that made your countenance fall, but don't bring my gift in here with a fallen countenance. Go get that right. So even if you can't feel happy, you can be happy. Your feelings aren't always under your control, but how you decide to be. Do you notice how many times words that we take as emotion are actually verbs in Scripture? Love, an expression of love, is always an expression of doing something. So if I say I love you, to us it's kind of a huggy feely thing, but in Scripture it's an action. It's what I do. I do something positive for you if I love you. So it's a very dynamic, action-based word. And to us, if we don't feel it, then it's not real. But that's not true. That's not what's written. What's written is if we're going to serve him, we don't want to serve him out of grief. We need to pray through it. We need to study through it. We need to talk to ourselves and say, self, how many times in the Psalms does it say, oh, my soul, why are you cast down? Do people talk to themselves in the Psalms? It says, bless the Lord, oh, my soul. Well, why do you have to tell your soul to bless him? Wouldn't it want to bless him already? No, because it's a nefesh. It's a soul. It's an emotion. It's your spirit talking to your soul. The church world calls it the flesh. Well, the soul is encased in flesh. They conspire against you most days, especially when it comes to things in the refrigerator. But anyway, that's a different story. You have to talk to your soul and say things to your soul that begin with, it is written. And so I may go forgive this brother or make it right with this brother, or in order to make it right, I might even apologize for something I don't feel like really that was all my fault. But for the sake of peace, I'm going to make peace because I want to be released from the fishing hook that goes into me, that goes into my soul when I'm in a state of unforgiveness. See, now he controls me. He may not even be aware. He may not even want to control me. But because he controls my emotions, now we are hooked together. And now my gift is attached to my grief concerning this person over here. So with these Torah portion, it's saying, I want you to be free, a free nation, to serve me. You can choose to do it, but it's not because anyone is standing over you making, yeah, there's these curses over here, and yes, this will happen, but that's not what I want you to think about. Because, how do we know that? He says, at least twice, in chapter 30, verse 2, and you return to the Lord your God, and you and your children heed his command with all your heart and soul. All your heart and soul. All your lev, heart, and your soul, nefesh. with all your emotion, with all your intellect, with every appetite that you have, when you return and heed this command with all your heart and soul, just as I enjoin upon you this day, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and take you back in love. Take you back in love. See how there's an action with love? I will take you back. Right? He will bring you together again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. So as long as we're still running circles around the Torah here, getting hung up on doctrine after doctrine after doctrine, getting into social media argument after argument after argument. No, that's not what it says. This is what it said. Why are we going in circles? Why have we been so long at this mountain? Because there's still a gall of bitterness attached to a lot of us. We're still offended sometimes at the church. We're still offended sometimes at the rabbis. Maybe we're still offended at parents that didn't bring us up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. There can be a million things we're still grieved and mourning over. We're still mourning over lost time. How many of you have ever mourned over lost time? Time that has been wasted, that I could have been learning the issues of life right here from the tree of life. And what happened, instead of saying, thank you, Christianity, thank you, good old pastor, you fill it in, or thank you, good old rabbi so-and-so, thank you for the foundation that you gave me. You did what you could with what you had. And now I'm going to proceed on. I'm going to take what you gave me, whatever that is, and I'm going to invest it. And I'm going to study. Well, my goodness, if the person's not going with you, leave them behind, but don't be angry with them because they did bring you as far as they could. So don't grieve over lost time. See, all that stuff, we've talked about this before about the Aruv Tavshalin. Anything you've started in good faith, you're going to have time to finish it. You'll have 1,000 years. And if you can't get it done in 1,000 years, then how long is it going to take you, right? So that's a pretty good time stretch for you to finish all those things that you started. So don't be grieved with the church. Don't be grieved with people that disagree with you on doctrine or whatever. Don't grieve when you're studying this Holy Torah. Don't study it in order to prove someone wrong. Study it out of a free heart. Don't be attached to that offense because someone offended you on Facebook or someone wrote a nasty blog or somebody's put out some weird DVD. Don't attach grief to your study. Come in and set your basket down before the altar and say, hey, I'm coming in here with a joyful heart. I am returning with all my heart and soul because I want to go into the land. And I want to learn how to control my heart and my soul. That's why we're told in the Shema. You ever wonder at the language of the Shema? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, nefesh, and with all your strength, with all your resources. We're not really even talking about your spirit right there. We're still talking about things at the soul level, your heart, the thoughts of your heart. That's still talking about the level of the soul, which is housed in your body. The spirit came from heaven, and it's always going to identify with it is written. The joy that you feel and the elation that you feel when you read the Holy Scriptures, that's the being joyful that's inside there if you can find it. What you can't do is let any grief or unforgiveness attach itself to your Torah study. Only go into your Torah study as a free person. Do not go in there like a captive woman. I don't have a choice. Don't go in there under coercion. Don't go in there to compete. See, Cain brought his offering to compete. It was a competition. And then when he didn't win the competition, like we said, I believe his countenance was already fallen before he ever went in, or he would have cleaned out the first fruits and brought them in. And all of a sudden, well, why are you being nice to Abel and you're not being nice to me? Why am I not getting the respect for my blog that so-and-so is getting for their blog? Why am I not getting 50 likes on my Facebook page when I post something I know is inspirational? See, you get in that spirit of competition and it's a downward spiral. And then all of a sudden, you're not studying Torah with all your heart and your soul. You're studying it like a slave to your emotions. See, he brought a people out of Egypt. He took their bodies out of Egypt. But where was their soul? Egypt. We want the food we had in Egypt. We want the water we had in Egypt. Egypt was a land flowing with milk and honey. You didn't bring us to a land flowing with milk and honey, and they didn't even know what milk and honey was. They didn't know that the Torah, it's like milk and honey on your tongue. They kept looking for the physical and completely missing the spiritual. Yeshua said, I was that manna from heaven. I was the living word. And they had to kneel down every morning and completely miss what was going on, because they were gathering physical bread and I was offering them the spiritual with the physical. But instead, what did they do? They tested. Let's gather more than he said and just see what happens. How about some worms? Right? Let's go out and pick up sticks. Let's go build a fire. Then what happens? Bad stuff, man. You get stoned when stuff like that happens, right? And not in a good way. What did they do? They kept testing because they were still captive. They were still slaves in Egypt. So Passover, it's going to symbolize for us, yes, he saved my soul. He brought me out initially. But then over in the Brit Chadashah, it talks about the end of your faith. It says, even the salvation of your soul. Okay, that'll go over big with the Baptist, right? Because to them, the question is, once saved, always saved. But there's more to it. Once you were a free person, physically, how do we free your soul? Remember in the psalm, it says, my soul escaped like a bird out of the snare of the fowler. Well, how do you get snared? You get snared by what you want. And with Eve, she kind of got hit on all of it. She thought the fruit looked good. She thought the fruit would taste good. And she thought it would make her wise. So every sensory perception and intellectual bait was offered. Why? It was a bait to the soul. And so when we're using the Torah to satisfy something for ourselves, rather than to deal with our neighbor in a proper way, and therefore deal with heaven and its requirements to kitabo, to elevate to a holier place. When we elevate to that holier place in kitabo, we're saying, I've got a handle on this stuff. You know what? A dozen bad things could have happened while I was cleaning out my tithe. And I may have felt unhappy at times, but I was not unhappy, because in my spirit there was a joy that I had the privilege of bringing this tithe together, that I held nothing back. So you have to talk to your feelings sometimes and just decide, it doesn't matter how I feel this morning. I am happy. I am joyful. And maybe your face won't reflect it. You can look at me sometimes and you think I'm ready to rip somebody's head off. It doesn't matter. I might be just thinking about something. All right. I tend to kind of go inside my own head when I'm thinking about something. But the truth is, it is written, I'm joyful. I'm absolutely joyful, but I don't feel like it. Who cares how we feel? Nobody cares how we feel. They care how we are when we're keeping Torah. And if, even in grief, if you are keeping the Torah from an inner joy, What does it say? Joy unspeakable. Why can't you speak about it? Because it doesn't make any sense. I shouldn't be happy right now. I shouldn't be joyful right now. But there's joy in the Torah. There's joy in these treasures. It's not always easy because it's just like that snare. It's like the fowler. He knows where the bird's going to be, and that's where he goes. So if there's any emotion that you tend to be enslaved to, that you tend to let dominate your spirit, the soul dominating the spirit, if there's any weakness, the adversary knows it. That's the exact bait that he's going to use. He's going to go to that path where that bird always is, and he's going to set up shop there. And that's why we have to know ourselves. We have to know our own weaknesses. If we don't know them, trust me, the predator does. We know enough about human nature at our ages. We know that there are predators out there, and they know where we're weak. They know where we're vulnerable. So Nitzavim, the Torah portion this week, it's carrying over. It's like pulling this thread through, and it's saying, well, you're telling me I'm going to have to repent if you're going to bring me back, and I'm going to be able to kitabo and experience this higher level of holiness and joy and all this wonderful stuff. But in Nitzavim, again, it feels like there's threats in here. He says, set before you this day life and prosperity, death and adversity. Well, those choices have always been there, by the way. It's not really a new Torah portion, right? It's actually been there from the beginning, from Genesis. But he says, this is not too high for you. This is not too difficult. You don't have to go up to heaven and get it. You don't have to go to the bottom of the sea or beyond the sea. It's right here. It's in your mouth. It's what comes out of your mouth, because what's in your heart is going to come out of your mouth. Right? Now, sometimes that's a good thing. And sometimes that's a bad thing. Because sometimes your mouth lets you know what's in your heart. But if you're trying to fix this captivity state to your soul, and your soul keeps churning out things you know are not true, that are not written, that are not the joyful response to the Torah, then at least you know what's in there. And you can start to clean it out. You can start to deal with it. You know, it says in Psalm, it says, when my heart was chametz, I was like a beast within. I was ignorant and I was senseless. All right. I think that's usually translated, when my heart was, I can't even think of the last English translation I read, but the idea that your heart is chametz. What does that mean? It means when it's bitter. And I think that is one translate, when my heart was embittered, when I was chametz. So at Pesach, at Passover, you clean out the chametz just from your house? No, you go in your heart. You go in your lev. Remember, you have to bring it with all your heart and soul. How are you going to bring a Passover sacrifice with all your heart and soul if your heart and your soul are still captive to Pharaoh? What kind of things does Pharaoh say? I don't care if you're wanting to celebrate some feast to this Yod Hey Vav Hey of yours. I don't know him. Go back to work. What does it say? Pharaoh embittered our lives. He made our hearts bitter. Was it just with the slavery? Or was there something else going on in their hearts? Is it a lesson to us? Sometimes we can become embittered just because it feels like we're swimming upstream with everything we want to do. We want to keep Shabbat. Our boss doesn't want us to keep Shabbat. We want to keep Sukkot. Our boss doesn't want us to keep Sukkot, or our bank account doesn't want us to keep Sukkot. There's all sorts of things. We would love to have a healthy congregation to go to. They're few and far in between. So everything I'm trying to do, I'm swimming upstream. Which I'm not saying I don't have a healthy congregation. I do. I have some place to go when we're in town. Okay, just let me clarify that one. But not everybody does. For some people, just getting into a class like this is really all the human contact they have, other than reading. And so everything it's upstream. You can go spend a week in Jerusalem, in my favorite neighborhood, German colony, little modern Orthodox section of town. Everything that is hard to do here, you would have to try hard. If you were there, you would have to try to violate Shabbat. Okay, you would just have to predetermine, I'm going to be the weird one. Because the restaurant shut down in the early afternoon. In the mornings, they'll put out these buffets where you can, if you want to buy your Shabbat food, you go through there, you buy your Shabbat food, they weigh it, you pay for it, you can take it back if you're not cooking. They have the wine set out there, they have the challah. The bakeries are going 90 miles an hour, sticking that challah out there for you to buy. They've got all kinds of desserts and things. There's flowers are out there, so you can grab the flowers on your way back to your apartment. About 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, what was bumper to bumper traffic, you can walk down the center of the street if you want to. So these things, these are obstacles. Remember, we're constantly being told to overcome. Don't forget your first love. But over time, man, does it drag you down. It can. Because you're trying so hard to do the things that you know the Father wants you to do, and you're trying to do them because your heart is repentant. I do want to go back, Father. I don't like being scattered out here like it says in Nitzavim. And that was part of it. You're going to be scattered out there everywhere. I mean, he says it again in verse 6 of chapter 30. He says, the Lord your God will open up your heart and the hearts of your offspring to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul in order that you may live. And that's what we're saying. You've opened up my heart and my soul. Let me live. I'm stuck here. I am definitely a fish out of water. It's like the whole world wants to do something different than what you have written and what's in my heart. But you can actually let that become a point of bitterness. That's why you have to go back to your first love. And sometimes it's just, we tend to be perfectionists and we want to do everything perfectly. I want to keep the perfect Passover Seder. I want to have all the right things on the plate. And I want to have the perfect Passover Haggadah, and we'll take out all that rabbinic stuff. And we have to make sure everybody's circumcised. And have you guys heard any of those arguments or got involved in them? Don't raise your hand. Please don't raise your hand. We've all been around them, right? And we all had questions. Of course, I'm thinking, who's the circumcision inspector? Who signed up for that one? I don't want to know. But we get into all this correctness. We think we want to do everything perfectly, but before we know it, that love in our hearts that I want to please the Father. I don't want to waste any more time doing the wrong things. And then we don't even give ourselves any grace. We have no predisposition of grace toward ourselves. And if we don't give it to ourselves, how are we going to give it to someone else who's trying to put that egg on the Seder plate? Horrors, right? We got to calm down. Because once we feel ourselves attaching bitterness and anger and mourning to our feasts, we've lost the connection. We've lost our first love. These feasts are a love relationship with the Father, and they go all the way back to the creation. They go back to the 4th day of creation. It says on the 4th day, he put the sun, the moon, and the stars. It says for the sake of the Moedim. Before there was a human being on earth to argue about them, they were in place. So the Moedim are going to occur whether we argue about them or don't. Whether we keep them or whether we don't. They're still there because they came from eternity. They came from spiritual realms. And when this earth melts away, they will continue and persist into eternity. How they'll look, I don't know. But the principles, those stand. How do we know that? Let's see, I'm pretty sure I put it in the workbook. Yes, Psalm 75, 2-9. Says, when I select an appointed time, a moed, it is I who judge with equity. The earth and all who dwell in it melt. It is I who have firmly set its pillars. Amudeha. All right. Here's where there's two things happening. And if I think about one too long, I'll forget the other one. That's just how old I am. The pillars, the standing part, amad, all right, and then the moed. It's talking about a time of judgment. And he says, I've firmly set its pillars. Well, he's pretty much just told us that the earth is going to melt. So what has its pillars so firmly set that it becomes permanent? He has to be talking about the Moedim. These appointed times, they're spiritual principles. We tend to reduce them down to a series of physical acts or symbols or, in some cases, idioms, phrases, and so forth. But he's telling us right here, I have firmly set its pillars. Amudeha, the root word there is going to be amad, which is also the Hebrew word for just stand. Achshav ani lo omedet. I'm not standing right now. Okay. Aval ani omedet. Okay, it's a verb, to stand. And the implication is it's something that's permanent, especially when we apply it in its context to the noun, which means a pillar. Something that will endure, I believe is the Strong's description. Something that endures. So, what's going on here? It goes back to the words. We could connect kitetse to kitavo. They had similar themes. Now he starts out with Nitzavim, which means you were standing. You were standing here today. And the idea of standing is that one who serves willingly stands. Remember, the priest stood to serve. The Levites stood to serve. It was free will. Right? That's the implication of standing. Free will. Not the captive woman. Not the, I better do this or I won't get any rain. Right? Now the threat is there. If that's where you want to operate, is in that spirit of fear. And it's just like with your kids. Do you want to discipline them and punish them into obeying you? Or would you like for them to just obey you because they love you and trust you enough? You want a little bitachon. You want some, trust. You want them to feel secure enough with your advice and your discipline that if you said to do something, they would just trust this is for my own good. They're just not exercising, some sort of power here. They're on a power trip. No, I love my mom. I love my dad. And they've been pretty much right so far. You're probably not going to hear that until they're in their 30s. But anyway, that's the hope. And that's what the Father wants from us. He wants to hear, I trust you, and you've been right so far. Sometimes we do have trouble admitting when he's right. That thing about you're going to be happy. And I'm like, If I don't feel happy, I'm not happy. He said, you're going to be happy. Why? Because he ties it to these feasts. These feasts, these Moedim, these firmly set pillars, these things that endure. It's actually an equivalent expression in our text. If we go to the beginning of Nitzavim, which is, excuse me, going to be Deuteronomy chapter, well, it cuts off here, 29 and verse 9. Nitzavim, you stand this day, all of you, before the Lord your God. You stand, right? They're reaffirming the covenant. Remember, he just said you can't go in this in a state of mourning. If you're going to kitavo, there has to be joy. And it's so important that you've got to say you're happy. You've got to say you didn't touch it while you were grieving. You've got to say you never dedicated any of it to the dead people. Right? And that's one of the issues with tattoos, is a lot of times they're done as a memorial. It says, don't remember people like that. All right? I'm going to inscribe some things on you, and it shows that I own you. In fact, we're inscribed in the palms of his hands, right? Right? We are not to inscribe him on the palms of our hands. Our kids are having trouble with that. Well, sometimes our grown-ups are having trouble with that too, from what I've seen here lately. But the idea is the Holy One alone has the power to inscribe on our bodies anything. And he definitely doesn't want these bodies offered. If we're going to stand freely, then why do we have the sign of a slave or the sign of a mourner on our bodies? Now, just remember, if you get a tattoo, it's only sin once. Does that make sense? Did you transgress when you got the tattoo? Yes, but then after that, you don't have to say, I'm in eternal sin. You're not. It was only wrong one time. You repent, you say that was wrong, and you're good, right? You'll see Orthodox Jews all the time. If they're Baal Teshuvah, which meant they were out of the faith, now they're back in the faith, they may have gotten tattoos, and if you'll ever see those guys with their sleeves rolled up, they might have tattoos down their arms, right? But it was only wrong once. But the spiritual principle we're looking at here is don't associate your body with death ritual. Don't get involved with death ritual. That's one of the big things with Halloween and what they pulled out of paganism and witches and so forth. These are things, not just spells and stuff, it's death things. Don't associate yourself with the realm of death. Just don't do that. Right? If anybody's going to do any writing on you, it's going to be him. He's going to inscribe something and he's going to seal it up. Right? And so we don't need to be doing graffiti while we wait. That's kind of the message. But anyway, but he says, you stand this day, all of you. All of who? All the people who are going to kitavo. Were you there? That's going to be where you do thumbs up or head nod. Yes, yes, I was there. I was there. All of you before the Lord your God, your tribal heads, your elders, your officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your wives, even the stranger within your camp, from woodchopper to water drawer, to enter into the covenant of the Lord your God, which the Lord your God is concluding with you this day, with its sanctions, to the end that he may establish you this day as his people and be your God, as he promised you and as he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Notice the covenant was already made back at Sinai. In fact, covenants were made back with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he calls their names just to remind you. It goes even farther back. But as a people, as a nation, there was a seed in Abraham, and it was a nation. There was a seed in Isaac, it was a nation. There was a seed in Jacob, it was a nation. And then at Sinai, you're a nation. But now he says again that he may establish you this day. Okay, so when is it? Was it in Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Sinai? The answer is yes. Some of y'all, you already knew the answer. All right, that's my favorite word is yes. So what is he saying? He's reaffirming this covenant, and he says the important thing, starting it off, is you are standing. You know, they they came out of Egypt with an upraised arm, and it didn't take long for those arms to fall, right? He says, no, I've been growing you up this 40 years in the wilderness. What have we been doing? We've been unchaining you. We've been unchaining your soul from your Egyptian appetites. We've been unchaining your soul from your Egyptian intellect. We've been unchaining your soul from your Egyptian desire. Remember the golden calf? They had a lot of the same sexual desires. They learned these things in Egypt. They brought them back out. And then they tried to mix them up with Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, and that didn't work, right? So we're unchaining you from this Egyptian mindset. We're unchaining you from this bitterness, all right? He took their bodies out, but there was still a bitterness and a grief, and they constantly were bitter and grieving in the desert. Everything made them mourning and unhappy and all that, or angry. It was just like one bad emotion to the next, right? Because they were chained to their emotions. And Yeshua doesn't come to leave us. He said, okay, I got your body when you die. But he wants our souls to undergo a transformation. Yeshua wants to free our souls. That's why it says the end of your faith, even the salvation of your souls. He doesn't want to present you to the Father in the same condition in which he found you. And the Father says, well, what have they been doing for the last 40 years? They're still keeping my word, but they're all mad about it. They're keeping my feasts, but they fight over them. They eat my food, but they complain about it. Who ordered the food for Sukkot this year? That was the most tasteless stuff I ever put in my mouth. Where we heard that before? When our souls were chained to Pharaoh. So Yeshua is going to come, and through his feasts, goes back to the Amad, the pillars of the Moedim. You are standing today, and we're going to reaffirm this. While you're standing as free people, when you're grieving, I'm close to you, is what he's saying. I'm close to a broken heart. But when your heart is free, then you can serve me. Because you can stand there and freely enter into that agreement without being captive to grief and mourning. So as we move over, and we're going to go over to verse, looks like 14. Trying to line up the Hebrew with the English here. But here, he's talking to them. In English, it says, but both with those who were standing here with us this day before the Lord our God, and with those who are not with us here today. So that's good news. We were there, right? Because we are standing. Well, we want to make sure we're standing. We want to make sure we're not crawling around in the sand, right? Looking for cucumbers and leeks and bags full of worms because we picked up too much stuff on Shabbat, and little sticks stuck in our hair because we thought we could sneak out and kindle a fire, right? Standing, free people, standing up on your own 2 feet like a priest, a free person. And in this case, he started out with Nitzavim. That's one word for standing. And now he says, po, here, imano, omet, hayom. And the beauty of that grammar is that he's saying here, in us, stand today. And it's singular. It's talking about many. It's talking about a whole nation. but it's using singular, omed, not omdim, omed, one single pillar, one single community. So he's connecting omed to amad, to the feasts. What has pulled them together? What has held Israel together, not just in the wilderness, but up until today? What distinguishes them and sets them apart? The Moedim, because that's when they stand to serve. They stand to serve on Shabbat, and that's a category of work, avodah. It's not malacha. Malacha is prohibited work on Shabbat. But avodah, service, is permitted in the tabernacle on Shabbat. So you can omed to oved. All right? You can stand to serve on Shabbat, on Passover, the days of unleavened bread, the first fruits of the barley, the first fruits of the wheat at Shavuot, at Rosh Hashanah, Feast of Trumpets, at Yom Kippur, at Sukkot, including its 8th day. You can stand at every one of those feasts to serve. Why? Because it's through these feasts that we learn how to stand. It's through these feasts that we learn how not to crawl around on our hands and knees like a bunch of babies looking for milk and honey when he's saying, hey, look, stand up and make a covenant here. Freely enter in. And he says, if you can't do that, it's because the heart and soul is not coming with you. Your heart and your soul are still in Egypt. Your heart and your soul are still in a state of mourning. Your heart and your soul are still in a state of resentment. Your heart and your soul are still in a state of competitiveness. If you come here like that, you are not standing. At least not in the sense that one stands to make a covenant this day. So yes, we want to kitavo. We want to go in and we want to realize that elevated state of holiness that can only be accomplished, he told us last week, with a pure heart. He's telling us the same thing today. And the way that we're going to rehearse, because as you're reading through here, I mean, he talks about scattering us out there and so forth. And he says, you know how we dwelt in the land of Egypt? We passed through the midst of various other nations, and you've seen the detestable things. He says, perchance there is among you some man or woman, some clan or tribe, whose heart even now is turning away from the Lord our God to go and worship the gods of those nations. Perchance there is among you a stock sprouting poison weed and wormwood. When such a one hears the words of these sanctions, he may fancy himself immune, thinking, I shall be safe, though I follow my own willful heart, to the utter ruin of moist and dry alike. All right, and then something pretty dire follows that. But he's saying you could be standing here with a nation, but yet in your heart, it even talks about this, I believe, in the book of Jude, where it talks about in those days, there's going to be wicked people. And he says they'll even come to your love feasts. They'll come to your Moedim. But he said they're hidden reefs. They're there to trip you up. They're like that fowler that's going to snare that bird, knowing where it goes. If the adversary wants to snare you, little bird, where will he set up his net or his pit? At a feast on Shabbat. That's a given. If it is your custom, like Yeshua's, to go to the synagogue or to go to your congregation on Shabbat and set that day aside as holy, you can bet the hunter knows you're there. And if he wants to hunt you, he will set up shop. to snare you along the way. If it is your custom to observe the Passover and Shavuot and Sukkot, you can bet your bottom dollar in basket that he will try to make sure that the fruit you bring at Sukkot is defective and that you're holding something back in grief and that you have not made it right with your brother and that you're not wanting to share yourself. Remember, Gamhu, Abel brought himself. It says, Gamhu. Abel didn't just bring the choicest of his flock. The text, the grammar of the language in Genesis says that Abel also brought himself. So I say, what's in that basket at Sukkot represents you. What are you holding back? What are you refusing to share with your brother? When you bring your sacrifice in, don't look at what's in somebody else's basket. Please don't compare your offering to someone else's, because what is your best today has nothing to do with what's in Abel's basket. You bring the best you can possibly bring in a joyful state. And he will take that and work with that. And then he talks about the increase. If you will do that, if you can stand there, enter into the covenant, say, I've held nothing back. I've been joyful in bringing myself in. There's nothing in my heart that thinks I can do whatever I want. There's a lot of people out there, people just like us. But remember what Jude said about the hidden reefs at your Moedim, at your love feasts? They have set up shop to capture us there. They know where we go, and they know when we go. They know the appointed time. It says even a stork knows the appointed times. It says my people don't know their times. Okay? We know the times, but we can't be as foolish as a stork and stumble into a snare. And I don't know. See, each of us, we have different places we go for Sukkot or Passover or Shavuot. And so we have to look and see, what are the snares? Let me look at my resume here. Let me see what's on my resume. And are there things on my Moedim resume that I would rather not have on there? That tells you where we got tripped up last time. Right? And so what things can I see coming now that I can go ahead and take care of with my brother so that neither one of us has to have a countenance fall over an offering at Sukkot? So that neither one of us has to have a countenance fall because we didn't get our way with just how we wanted the Passover Seder to go. And you're saying, well, where do I find that? I don't know. We're still a ways out, in my estimation. But we're getting what it says. We first had to know the appointed time. All right? That's the first step. Did the Israelites know their appointed time? They did, because Moses says, Pharaoh, you need to let us go out here 3 days' journey into the wilderness and have a feast, or we're going to get plague. We're going to get all sorts of stuff going to happen to us. They knew the appointed time. It didn't mean that they were ready to do it with a whole heart. But I guarantee you, when the firstborn was on the line, they held nothing back. I guarantee you there wasn't a spot on the doorpost that wasn't covered in blood. And see, when he gets that serious with us in a time of tribulation, what is he doing? He's showing which one thinks in his heart that he can do whatever he wants. And there's not going to be consequences. And he uses interesting word there, and I'll probably go into more detail with the Tuesday class about where he calls it poison weed and wormwood. Because we know wormwood is something that appears in the apocalyptic literature of Revelation. So if you want to understand the wormwood in Revelation, then you have to understand what he's dealing with here in Nitzavim. Short story, because I didn't want to go over and lose our data. Wormwood numbs. All right, it just numbs something. From ancient times, that's what it was used for. And that's why he says, when one hears the words of these sanctions, he may think himself immune, thinking, I'll be safe, even though I follow my own willful heart. In other words, he's followed his own will. He's been captive to his own nefesh, that the thoughts of that nefesh has convinced him, has actually numbed him to hearing the results, the curses that the word says, if you choose to do this, this is what's going to happen. You can actually keep doing the sin, even secretly, and get to the point where nothing good or bad is going to happen. You know, maybe Adam and Eve, this day, you know, the day you eat of it, surely you're going to die. I'm like, well, we're still here. No, they were dead. They began the process of dying. And the more we think we can get away with things, the more numb, the more wormwood we're drinking. Because it's numbing us to the fact that actually Adonai has anger and rage. And it's righteous anger and rage. Because he says, such a person, he says, the Lord will never forgive him. Rather will the Lord's anger and passion rage against that man, till every sanction recorded in this book comes down upon him, and the Lord blots out his name from under heaven. Yikes. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording here.